Good evening, cryptid lovers of the interwebs. I'm Alexa, the resident ooky spooky girly, and today we're diving back into the world of cryptid horrors. Question for y'all, what's your favorite cryptid? I'm partial to Nessie, but welcome to the top 5 disturbing cryptids that left scientists terrified. Number 5, Bigfoot or the Devil. Our first account for the day comes from scientist Jim Brittle and his cousin and takes place near Johnson City, Tennessee. Granted, every story I'll be recounting today comes from scientists, so I suppose I won't have to state that every time, but I wanted to make sure, that I made it clear from the get-go. So Jim and his cousin were out hunting, as one does, and found themselves sitting on the side of the wall of a rather large hollow, which consisted of very thick underbrush and lots of evergreen trees in a valley that led first to a clearing and then on to a supposed old graveyard. If I've said it once, I've said it a million times, don't mess around near graveyards, but here goes nothing. All of a sudden the duo heard the brush in the hollow below rattling and could tell that whatever was making the sounds was rather large. Jim had a firearm with him for safety, and using the night vision scope, he managed to make out what appeared to be a man at first, but he soon realized that the man was a creature about 7 to 8 feet tall, 450 pounds, covered in thick black fur with long tapered horns pointing straight up from either side of its head. Now, by this point, Jim and his cousin were terrified, so he fired off his weapon repeatedly before retreating into a nearby cabin. The next morning, all the two could find were a bucket load of spent shell casings and holes in a walnut tree. Nearby animal traps had been sprung and all the bait was gone. On a nearby ridge, the men located a series of tunnels made up of brush and various sizes of tree limbs, vines, and leaves, and pondered if it could be the beast's lair, but they didn't feel like tempting fate again to find out. They quickly returned home and never went into that area again, and thank goodness for that. Number 4, Mothman. Time to travel over to Waterville, Maine in late summer of 1971, where even I can't wrap my head around what happened. Dr. Sally Daniels was newly married and living in Killeen, Texas in a small duplex with her husband who was in the army. One night he was off duty while Sally was home alone in bed, and around 3 a.m. in the morning, otherwise known as witching hour, she woke up and saw a black figure standing at the bottom of her bed. She described it as 8 or 9 feet tall with huge big black wings and red eyes. Now, like any rational person, she tried closing her eyes and going back to sleep, or pretending it wasn't happening, but when she opened them again, the creature had moved to the right side of her bed. Sally was now frozen in fear, unable to scream, and darted under her blankets in a state of panic until the creature left. Shortly after this event, Sally moved to Maine because she was way too frightened to ever stay alone at night when her husband had duty. She had mentioned to her mom about seeing that huge black angel, and the mom was glad Sally came home as that didn't sound good. At the time she had never heard of the Mothman, but a few years later she came across an article and a drawing of one, finally giving her an answer as to what she saw that fateful night. Number 3, more Bigfoot. So now we travel over to southeast Oklahoma with a tale from Susan Paulson. It was just another day and she was checking on the animals when the weather radio blared out a tornado warning. So at the time there was a large storm over the area and an advisory was indeed in effect. So while she wasn't surprised, Susan quickly closed up the barn door and hurried towards the house, finding her offspring and husband. They got themselves into a shelter, barred the metal door, and sat waiting for the worst. About 5 minutes after they settled into the dugout, the wind started picking up outside and the whole family could hear thunder and rain outside of the doors. It was soon joined by the impacts of large hail hitting the metal door as the sound of the wind changed to a roar similar to a plane about to take off. They could hear the different sounds of objects hitting the door, but particularly a loud crack and lots of scraping on the door. In total, the entire event lasted maybe 7 minutes, but the family didn't try to leave the dugout until the wind died down, which, it makes sense. Susan's husband unbarred the door and tried opening it, but it would only open about an inch. They could see through the crack that the apple tree next to the dugout had blown over in front of the door, and heck, they tried to pry the door open every which way, slamming their bodies against the door, but nothing worked. The family was completely stuck in the shelter, but they knew at some point there would be people checking on places in the tornado's path, so they stuck a piece of wood in the crack of the door to hold it open and got comfortable and prepared to wait. When 7 p.m. rolled around, they discovered that claustrophobia and panic attacks can strike anyone, no matter how prepared you are. So technically the family was safe and prepared physically for a week, but Susan's not sure their minds could have lasted a week. They could see it was dark through the crack of the door when a foul odor wafted in, smelling like a wet dog combined with a male goat and a teenager's armpits. Now Susan originally thought it was an overly pungent skunk and she went to shut the door, but stopped when she heard what sounded like footsteps. The family started yelling for help, calling out to whoever was out there, but nobody responded. There was a shuffling sound and the smell got even stronger, causing Susan's eyes to water as she yelled out and pounded on the door. She heard a grunt before the sound of footsteps and the odor started fading away. Eventually the footsteps returned, and while everyone trapped, yelled and pounded on the door, once again there was no response and the footsteps left once more. This time Susan felt uneasy and barred the door shut. Something just wasn't right with this person. At around 3 in the morning, Are we sensing a pattern? Susan's daughter woke up from a nightmare and started crying, and Susan was comforting her when she heard branches cracking and scraping against the door along with grunting. She woke her husband up, and once again, they pounded on the door and yelled, this time leaving the door open as much as possible. Just a couple of inches, man. When the noises outside stopped, they waited about 10 minutes to try to open the door, and this time it opened enough for the family to be able to step out. The trunk of the tree was lying near the door, but there was a pile of branches off to the side, and in that ground outside, there were a lot of footprints bigger than any foot Susan had ever seen. After tucking the offspring in their proper beds, Susan headed out to the barn to see if the animals were okay, and was about halfway there when she heard one of their hogs screaming. She ran towards the barn, and a few yards away, she could see her market-ready Hampshire barrow struggling and screaming while slung over the shoulder of a dark, hulking, human-like figure. Susan yelled at the figure to drop her peg, and it just turned and stared. She shined her flashlight at the creature's face, revealing a grayish face with a flat-looking nose. It was covered with thin, dark brown hair all over its body and massive feet. After a few seconds, it turned and walked into the cornfield towards the creek and disappeared from view. Yay for saving everyone, but bummer about losing the livestock. Number 2, a Glimmer Man in Chicago. So Stella's experience took place on September 2nd of 2022 after a day of running errands for her elderly father, when she returned to his apartment building and 6th floor residence. She went out onto the balcony for, smoke break, just standing and allowing her mind to go blank when she noticed a weird large tree about 20 feet away. Yeah, I'll elaborate. So one of the branches on the tree was bowing quite heavily, but Stella couldn't see anything on it that could be responsible for the weighing down. As she was staring at the branch and trying to make sense of what her eyes were seeing, an intense feeling of dread and fear came over her, as if every part of her body was screaming at her to turn around and run, but she didn't know why. At this very moment, the bowing branch that she had just been observing began to shake violently, and despite her internal instincts still screaming at Stella to leave, curiosity had now gotten the better of her, and she started to move along the railing to get a closer look. As your friendly narrator, this is where I interject and tell anyone with some sense to run, but hey, what do I know? A small form began to glimmer on the branch, and as Stella continued to watch in shock, a transparent human figure that shimmered a yellowish-white color developed. She snapped out of her fixated stare and quickly took a step back from the railing, realizing finally that this is something that should be feared. Glad the old common sense kicked in after the overwhelming fear, dread, and visual, should have kicked in sooner in my opinion, but that's just my usual snark kicking in. The shimmery being eventually dropped out of the tree, landing behind a man who happened to be walking past at the time. The walking man spun around, his reaction similar to, as if he had been hit with an object from behind, and was confused when all he saw was a cloud of smoke. The shimmery man had disappeared in said puff of smoke almost instantly after hitting the ground. Stella waited for some time, expecting to see this thing re-emerge, but it was completely gone. At the same time, another neighbor just a few floors below Stella and her dad had also observed exactly the same thing as her and managed to confirm all the same details. The neighbor and Stella then managed to track down the man who was walking past a few hours later, and after a conversation, confirmed that he had felt the weird impact, the overwhelming dread, but didn't see anything. Stella is positive that the Glimmer Man still roams the area, often feeling the overwhelming emotions from the day whenever she visits her dad, but hasn't spotted it since. My heart goes out to her, and I hope whatever it is buggers off soon. Number 1, not deer. I gotta say, I was definitely chuckling a bit at first when I was reading about this cryptid, but, seeing as where I'm from, that's just another way to lead into conversation about seeing a moose on the highway. And while the thought of driving within eyesight of a moose is scary enough, not deer are actually scarier. So this report comes from Elias Merritt in Roanoke, Virginia. Describing the time of day as almost dark, he was waiting for a friend to meet him for dinner when he experienced a feeling of something or someone watching him. He turned around suddenly and saw what he described as the shadow of a man behind a bush, which caused him to flee to the other side of the street, hiding in an area where he felt safer but could still see, if his friend was coming. As he stood in this new position, Elias saw 2 deer along the edge of the woods and watched them as they moved, observing that one of the deer seemed to have a bad back leg or was just injured. He walked in their direction to get a better look and see if he could help, but as he got closer, he realized they weren't deer and froze, petrified. The beings had oddly shaped heads and appeared to have patches of hair stitched over human skin. Both of the creatures looked in the direction of Elias and slowly stood up on their back legs and began running towards him, chasing him to the point where he was simply running and yelling in the direction of who knows what, no longer worried about waiting for his friend. He eventually ran into said friend and in a panic told him the entire story. And what do you know? The friend turned pale and explained that several years prior, he had had a similar experience while hunting in the forest outside of town, with his descriptions of the creatures being almost identical to what Elias had seen. Not to sound like a broken record, but I'm really glad I've never been like the nature hiking type. And that brings us to the end of our time, and I'm good on cryptid spottings for the day. If you enjoyed my ramblings, could you help us out by giving this video a like, subscribing if you aren't already, hit the bell for more from us here at Top 5 Scary Videos, and I'll see y'all next time, you lovely spooky people.